Governance expert and political analyst Professor William Gumede from the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand joins us now in the studio to unpack some of what we've seen. Perhaps let me just start with the comparisons between Polokwane and Nasrec 2017. How apt are they? I think a lot of the concentration has been around the tensions that we've seen, and in each of these, we've seen and heard the term watershed, but it can't be watershed all the time for it to remain so. So, are these apt, comparisons, or are people being reductionist about what is going on?
Thank you for having me on the program. Most probably, I think people are right when they say this is most probably, I think, the most divisive and the most tense conference so far in living memory, possibly at least since the ANC was unbanned in 1990. So because what we have seen this time, this was the first time that we've seen campaigns, actually presidential campaigns, although it is not official in the ANC, but you've seen the presidential candidates, roving around the country and actually physically campaigning. But what we see is also the kind of vicious attacks and defamation of rivals and so on. We haven't seen that before to this kind of intensity. And I wonder whether the ANC can bridge the divisions afterwards. Whoever gets elected president or in the top leadership or in the NS National Executive Committee, whether the divisions are not so deep this time that it may be almost impossible to paper over it ahead of the 2024 national elections.
I mean, just looking to what the president had to say in his political report, saying that they weren't able as a government to meet some of their policy directives of commitments because of COVID-19, the July riots, the KwaZulu-Natal floods. But I was actually just wondering, this is effectively looking at the past 3 years. Surely its governance track record, which has been waning for more than 10 years, I dare say, these factors can't be used as blame for why they haven't met their goals.
I mean, this is certainly, Ramaphosa's political report is certainly one of the most honest and frank reports. If you look at political reports, since the ANC was unbanned, if you look at those political reports, you compare this one, it was very honest. There was admittance that Ramaphosa admitted, ANC failed in government, poor governance, high levels of corruption, inability to turn around the state, incompetent people in key positions, and so on. So that's the first thing, is the acknowledgement. Is a very, very frank report. But, I think most probably this may be the last time an ANC president actually deliver a report when the governing party is in government. The next ANC conference is very likely that the party actually will be on the opposition benches, because what has happened is every year and every term, really almost every conference, the state capacity and the governance problems get worsened. So we haven't had a turn up. So it seems like, from Mandela onwards, so every conference we get, there's been a decline. And then there's been a sharper decline in the management of the economy, in the management of the state, in the management of society, in the management of the rule of law. And particularly from 2007 onwards, it's just gotten worse. And President Ramaphosa and his team has been unable to reverse the slides. And I think that is the key thing. So it's not just a report about the last 3 years, but it's almost a report really of the last 3 decades.
And how much do slate politics, factionalism have to deal with that? I mean, we've certainly seen the divisions play themselves out. So when President Cyril Ramaphosa talks about an inability to deliver on government policies and promises, and he points to the July riots, obviously there's been critical analysis of what was behind that, but it cannot be denied that its own factional politics did contribute to the July unrest. The manner in which the ANC is configured itself as a party, is it hindering it from delivering on its government plans and policies?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been the big talk about renewing the party. It started off with Thabo Mbeki during his reign. He wanted to modernize the party, and then it was rejected. And then, Jacob Zuma was elected, and Jacob Zuma had opposed the Mbeki renewal. And Cyril Ramaphosa has tried again now to renew. So clearly he also hasn't made much inroads. So I think there's a couple of fundamental things which clearly, if one look at this conference, needs to be renewed. Now, the first thing is, if you see what has happened today, the KwaZulu-Natal bloc had actually began to try to interrupt through singing the president and then called for change. So this block voting by provinces, I think it's important that in a renewal of the ANC that is abolished, because what that does, it encourages tribalism and regionalism and factionalism. So it encourages factionalism along provinces or along ethnic basis or, as I say, the regional basis. So I think it would be more appropriate for a modern ANC to change the governance system where members individually vote for the leadership. So, so if you're an individual member, so that you actually directly vote not through your province or not through your branch, but as an individual member. So that will then reduce the factionalism and the potential tribalism based on provinces.
But will it really? And I'm just thinking in terms of allegations we've heard of and seen in the past of people actually being paid off to vote a particular way. We know obviously it's against the law and it's virtually not possible, but in other countries it's... So what I'm saying is that an individual vote can be corrupted, can be manipulated. Is that really the answer?
Votes can always be manipulated. Obviously, the important thing is to outlaw that kind of practices, but it's very difficult to police it. But it is important. If you look at the equivalent parties, the ANC's peer parties, when they modernize, many of them introduce the system of, each person has a vote, and they've taken out the branch, that collective voting, in order to at least reduce factionalism and at least reduce the influence of group manipulation and group intimidation for people to vote along groups, and people feel intimidated because they're part of the group, and if they seem to vote outside the group, then they're going to be marginalized if they go back home. So I think it has to be part of the key renewal reforms. If it doesn't happen, the ANC is going to continue to have these sort of factionalism and provincialism and tribalism and so on. So I think going forward, for the ANC's own survival, it really needs to do that.
And this whole concept of the ANC as a modern political party, I mean, this conversation has also been ongoing for a very long time. There have been those in the party who've denied that they're not a modern political party. There are those who say they'll forever remain liberation struggle movement with properties of a modern political party. And the question has been asked if the two can coexist. But most importantly, I want to look at part of what they committed to at the 110th anniversary. That's the January 8th statement this year. So part of their priorities, and this is something that always features, building a social compact to decisively address unemployment and poverty. But that social compact is something that the party committed its individual members in 1995 to. I was speaking about this with Dr. Levi Ndo, asking members to cede their sovereignty for the greater good of the party and what it's driving for in terms of a democratic, transformed society. Is there synergy in these two objectives, or are they at odds?
Really the governance failure really of the party is that inability to move from a liberation movement into a political party. And that has been a failure also, since the end of the Second World War, of other African liberation movements that have failed in government. It's, that inability to transition from a liberation movement into a governing party. Now, in the places where that has actually happened successfly, there's very, very few, sadly very few in Africa where that has happened. It happened in Cape Verde with the PIGC, and it was really, really difficult struggle of moving out of that liberation mode and thinking. Because if you're in a liberation movement mode, you think about opposition. But if you're in government, you have to be responsible for government. You cannot talk and act like you're the opposition. You're in charge. So then you have to be acting as if you're in charge. Now, the governance problem about being a liberation movement is the fact that in a liberation movement, there is loyalty to the party and not loyalty to the constitution. And there is the interest of the party, not the interest of society.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because part of what they, committed to this year was defend our democratic gains against attempts to undermine our constitutional order and destabilize our democracy. And I'd just like to, springboard from what you're saying to the ESCOM example, which some people have said it is because of the party politics that we are in the position that we're in, rightly or wrongly, as to whether you agree or not. And I'm not necessarily sure that it can be the sole reason to say the behavior of the ANC within the ANC is to blame for why you had somebody like Andre de Ruyter leave, because he really wasn't in charge. I'd like to hear your thoughts from within this context.
let me just explain to you in terms of what it means to be when you're a liberation movement and how it impacts on a state-owned company like ESCOM. So it's obviously there's also other factors that have led to ESCOM's failure. But the first thing really has been that at a time in the late 90s, when the ESCOM management told the ANC government that, look, we need to modernize our equipment, our assets, and if you don't do that, in 10 years' time and so on, it will be depleted and we would have a crisis. Now, because the ANC was a liberation movement at the time, they said no. The leadership, it was then Thabo Mbeki, was in charge and says, we are the liberation movement in charge here. We hear you, but, despite we not knowing the technical things, we'll tell you politically, we're not going to do that. Okay, so that's really just the first thing about inner liberation, because if it's a modern political party, there's a division between the state and the party, and then the state-owned entities operate based on evidence independently. The party don't tell state-owned companies or the states in a modern party, in a democratic situation, what to do. Because if you're in an entity, you know what's going on. It's not the party. So, that blurring, in a liberation movement, there's a blurring between the state and the party, where people think when the party and the state is the same. And that's the whole thing about a liberation movement. Just the second thing, for example, is the idea of deployment. If you're a liberation movement, you only deploy your cadres. Now, in a democracy, when you have a modern political party, you don't appoint your cadres to the state. You appoint the best people in the state, because, the state is independent from the party. The party is governing the state. But the party is not appointing every little person in the states through deployment committees. That is a liberation movement thinking, and that is why we're in a crisis in ESCOM.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated. Wish we could speak a little bit more about this. Professor William Gumede, who is a governance expert, sharing his point of view on some of what came out of that ANC 55th National Conference. Still more to come here on The Globe. Do stay with us.